Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Twice Freed by Patricia Sanjan with permission of Christian Focus Publications, and we are reading Chapter 21. Onesimus grew stronger rapidly, and after 4 or 5 days he told Luke, the kindly physician, that he felt he should be moving on and not presume on Mistress Priscilla's hospitality any longer. His money was in a safe deposit at the barracks, and he would pay for his lodging and find other quarters. But first he had a favor to ask. Would Luke take him to visit Paul? Luke was surprised. He had sat daily with this unhappy boy and had spoken to him of Christ. But he had made no response, only moved his head restlessly on the pillow as though reluctant to hear. He did not know that Onesimus was haunted day and night by a burden of guilt that had suddenly become intolerable, and yet, glimpsing the price that he would have to pay to get rid of it, hardly dared face up to it. "We will go tomorrow," said Luke, "in the cool of the day. He is in prison near the Praetorium barracks." And they set out together the next evening. Onesimus, feeble as an old man, leaning on Luke's arm. Aquila lived in the Jewish quarters on the far side of the Tiber. So they crossed the river together and rested in one of the gardens in the bank. They went on slowly, and about sunset they reached the small house they had come to seek in the shadow of the barracks. "He has many, many visitors," said Luke, "and you may have to wait before he can give you an audience." He knocked at the door, and a voice bid him enter. "Is it Luke?" said the tired voice of an old man within. "I'm glad you have come. We have a singular joy this evening. Who do you think has arrived to visit us, all the way from Phrygia?" Phrygia. Onesimus would have fled, but curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. Luke drew him gently in, and when his eyes became accustomed to the gloom, he saw a sight he would never forget. A man, round-shouldered and small in stature, sat on a stool, chained by his wrist to a burly Roman guard who lay full length on the floor, fast asleep. The prisoner was the same Paul he had seen in Ephesus, but infinitely older and frailer, and he peered at the newcomers with dim, scarred eyes, as though he had difficulty in recognizing them. Yet his face was alight with joy as he looked round at the little group of disciples who sat at his feet, and as he laid his hand in loving welcome on the head of the tall, travel-stained newcomer. "Draw near and see for yourself, Luke. How often you have heard me speak of him, my brother in Christ, my beloved Ephorus from Asia." Travelers turned to greet Luke, and as he did, caught sight of the white-faced young man with the frightened, haunted eyes in the doorway. They remained staring at each other in amazement for a few moments, and then Ephorus spoke. "Can it be?" he said, puzzled. "Were you not for many years in attendance of Philemon's crippled son? I heard you had perished in the Laodicean disaster. How comes it that I find you here?" His voice was stern, and still Onesimus stood silent, rooted to the spot. "Fool," cried his reason, "turn and run. There is yet time. Think of the penalties of the runaway slave. Think of those who, for the same crime here in this city, have been branded, crucified, thrown to the beast. What are you waiting for? Those following feet have all but caught up with you now," said his heart. "You are all but cornered and at bay. Now is your last chance to escape. But if you escape now, you escape forever. Do you really want to escape?" So he stood his ground and answered humbly, "I am he. I escaped with my life and came to Rome. I have suffered many things, and the burden of my guilt has become intolerable, so that I no longer desire life. I have been sick and would rest now, but later on in the evening I pray that Master Paul will speak with me." In truth, his head was swimming, and the color had drained from his face, leaving it an ashen gray. He put out his hand to steady himself, and Luke was beside him in an instant. The doctor spread his own cloak on the floor and lay his patient down beside the Roman soldier. Onesimus closed his eyes and knew that this was the end. He was cornered and must turn and face up to the stern demands of love and bow to the new, eternal master. His brief, vain freedom was over. But what these demands would be, he was too tired and weak to think out. He lay very still and at peace and listened to the conversation of the little group. the first news he had received of his home for 2 years. They were speaking of the church in Hierapolis, Laodicea, and Colossae. All prospered, and Philemon and Apphia were well, strong in their love for Christ and for their brethren. Archippus had been sick and depressed, sometimes too tired to fulfill his ministry, yet battling on bravely. And now had joy been given to him that he never expected, for a tender attachment had grown up between him and a Christian maiden in Hierapolis. Yet the little church was in danger, and Ephoras's voice was urgent and anxious as he spoke of the heresy that threatened it. There was a young Phrygian who was trying to combine the simplicity of the gospel of Christ with his own pagan beliefs. Christian slaves had been partaking in strange rites, keeping feast, fasting till they were pale and weak, trying to rise by mortification of the flesh and a worship of angels to a gradual, painful knowledge of God. "This heresy is not preached in Philemon's house," said Ephorus, "but it has subverted many and even drawn some away who used to gather there. It flatters their intellects and not far removed from their own beliefs in spirit worship and mysteries." "As though Christ were not all in all," murmured the apostle, visibly agitated. "I must write them a letter begging them to beware, showing them again that in Christ dwells all the fullness of God. This is the only mystery they need ever explore." The Roman guard was relieved by a great fierce brute of a man who sat with his back to the wall, scowling and picking his teeth. Paul greeted him courteously, and the talk flowed on, but Onesimus lost the thread. By the light of the smoky lamp he was watching the faces of the little company, urgent and troubled. There was a thin, dedicated-looking young man named Timothy, whose eyes blazed with love as he watched the apostle, and another older man called Epaphroditus, who seemed to be convalescing from a serious illness. A third, with Jewish features, sat humbly in the background and said very little, probably a servant, though Onesimus sleepily and wondered how long they would go on talking. All night he imagined as another and another joined the group. A sharp-featured man named Demas came in and interrupted their discussion with news of what was happening in Rome. But no one seemed very interested, and the talk veered back to heresy in the churches until a brother named Tychicus arrived. He had been preaching to a group of Christians in another district of Rome and seemed encouraged. "We were a mixed company tonight," he said in a low voice, as to not awake the soldier who was snoring loudly. "Slaves, Jews, a few of Caesar's households, 2 or 3 from the guard. High, low, Jew, Gentile, all one in Christ. But Archippus, who sees Nero almost daily, thinks that the storm will soon break in good earnest, and it will no longer be safe to gather in private homes." Demas kicked him, and he broke off and looked around. He had not seen the stranger lying apparently asleep under the cloak in the shadow of the room. Onesimus, opening an eye, saw him stoop and trace that mysterious sign on the floor, and saw the others shake their heads. It was very late now, and the company knelt round the dying lamp, and Paul prayed long and lovingly for the flock of God in Rome, in Greece, in Asia, for those threatened by the ravening wolves in Colossae, for the burdened sinner sleeping on the floor. They blessed him as a father, and one by one they went off into the night, all except Timothy, who stayed and brought the old man food and drink, and would have settled him as comfortably as his chain would allow. "Are you going to sleep, my father?" "I think not, my son. I will speak with that boy who came tonight, if he is not asleep. Bring him to sup with us." "I am not asleep," said Onesimus. He felt rested and ready to talk. He joined Paul and Timothy at their humble meal, and then, down on the dark floor, with his face hidden, he told the apostle all: his hatred of Archippus, his revenge at Ephesus, the years of theft, the culminating robbery and the flight at Laodicea, the killing of his friend in the arena, and the final terror of death. Once he started, he felt he could never stop. All that had been locked in his angry, resentful, unhappy heart came flowing out that night like a black flood. Weary, Timothy lay down and slept, but Paul and Onesimus talked on. Was there hope? Was there forgiveness? Would Christ yet have mercy in spite of the years of refusal, and that determination to be free had brought him so low? He asked those questions again and again, and Paul spoke to him long and earnestly about the cross of Christ and all that it offered him. He can blot out that record of sin that is against you, said Paul. He can take it out of the way as though it were nailed to his cross. Justified by faith, you can have peace with God. I know. I have trotted this path. I saw Stephen the martyr die. I consented and guarded the clothes of those who stoned him. I know that torment of conscience. But I will tell you, too, how I saw Christ. It was almost morning when Paul finished that story. Onesimus listened entranced. Truly how very hard it had been to kick against the pricks. The guard stirred in his sleep. Onesimus lifted his eyes and saw the dawn stealing in through the bars of the prison room, and felt as though he had been born again, a little child in a fair new world. The burden had been lifted forever, and the joy of sin forgiven, he had barely as yet given a thought to the next step. Enough for the moment that he had come to Christ and Christ had received him. Yet deep down in his broken, happy heart lurked the question that Paul had asked on the Damascus road. Soon he must ask it too, and find out the answer. Lord, what would you have me to do? Tomorrow we'll read chapter 22. I love you, I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.